I'd like to welcome everyone to my podcast. This is Sandra Rupp. I am an executive coach and I like to talk to people about career, life, and leadership. I've had the privilege of working with many extraordinary leaders over the course of my career. First, as an executive search consultant in New York, I did searches and recruited in many different industries. And then I moved into executive coaching. I now live in sunny Florida and do a lot of executive coaching remotely with people both in the United States and also abroad. So I look forward to welcoming everyone here today. I have a really interesting topic to discuss, which is high functioning anxiety. And believe it or not, a lot of very successful leaders have it. And I wanted to do this podcast on this topic to make it more of a conversation about a topic that I think is very misunderstood. And I want to explain some of the research that I've found about it and also explain my own thoughts on high functioning anxiety, what it is, how to help someone who has it, tips, and so forth. I really believe that it is not, from what I've read, it's not a disorder at all. It actually is something that high performing people have. But it's a certain type of person. And so I can relate to that because I have had it myself. And I think that it's always good to get advice from people who have had the same problem. Because if you go to someone who's never had it, you're really not going to get the best advice. And I want to explain to you that high-performing anxiety is something that is common among people who are perfectionists, people who are conscientious, people pleasers. These can all be, good qualities in a certain amount, of course. Very conscientious, nice people have it. But also the problem with it is sometimes people that don't have those good qualities don't understand it. So this is actually a conversation for both people who have high functioning anxiety and people who don't. So if you have a friend who has it, perhaps this will help you understand it better. It's not something that you can fix. The person who has it has to figure out the best way to manage it. It may be a way of life, actually. But I have found tips and resources for how to think about it, because a lot of it comes from your brain and how you think. So you may be thinking of anxious thoughts because you're worried or you have fear, or you're always trying to be perfect or always trying to help and please people. But what you have to do is remember that self-care is also really important. So the first piece of advice I have to people is to remember that your health, your sleep, your nutrition, and your being able to have quiet time is probably the most important thing for you, because you cannot be helpful to other people unless you're taking care of your own health. And for introverts, a lot of people who have high functioning anxiety are on the introverted side, not all. It's probably about 70% are introverted. And it has something to do with the gene of high sensitivity, HSPs, which I've talked about in other videos. It was a gene discovered by Dr. Elaine Aron and her husband, and it was discovered in the early 90s. But what's interesting about sensitive central nervous systems, essentially is what it is, a trait of sensitivity, is that 30% of those people are actually extroverted and 70% of introverted are introverted. But high functioning anxiety often does occur in people that have sensitivity. So they are interlinked, and it's important to slow down for those people who are sensitive. Even if you're one of the 30% who are extroverted sensitives, you need more quiet time than other extroverts. So the reason is that your central nervous system is much more engaged, much more active. So the sounds, the sights, anything that your senses gather, the smells, everything is more intense for sensitive people. So I've said this before, but as an example, I can hear a pin drop before other people. Sensitive people will be able to relate to this. They can hear conversations, nearby. They can read body language. There's a sensitivity to people's thoughts and feelings and emotions that I can see. And that made me really good in the business world and corporate meetings, being able to read people's body language. I could tell when people are lying. I interviewed people for a living, very high level people. So I know a lot about people just from being able to be sensitive and gather some things that may be behind the scenes. And so these qualities are actually very positive things, the quality of sensitivity. And even anxiety is not always a negative thing, because I'll give you an example. My second tip for people that have anxiety is to learn more about your creative side, because for a lot of people who have anxiety, it means that you need to spend more time doing something creative. And that is probably the quickest way to have less anxiety, is to do something that is very creative. As an example, I've said this to people from time to time. There are people out there who are very into physical exercise. I call them the runner types, or, they're into marathons and triathletes, that sort of thing. So they need to run every day or swim every day or bike every day. But for those people who are creative, they need to be creative every day. And I'm one of those. So if I'm not doing something creative every day, and it can be something more personal too. It can be like fashion was always something I was very interested in, because it was really in business. It was one of the few ways I could use my creativity beyond creative thinking, of course, which I always used. Interior design is another thing I'm very good at, and people always compliment me on my skill sets in the creative areas. Part of that is because I'm a very visual person and I can see color. I'm more sensitive to colors and what goes together, what doesn't. And so there are a lot of positive things about creativity, sensitivity, and even anxiety. And I just want people to know that, because there are interesting stories out there. When Edith Wharton, one of the greatest female writers in American literature, was going through difficult times, I visited her home up in the Berkshires and learned this. A doctor came to see her at her home, and she was very unhappy in her marriage and eventually got a divorce. But what happened was the doctor said to her, "My advice to you is to start writing." So she had so much creative energy in her that was untapped. And she needed to do something creative to release that creative energy. So I think that's really an important tip for people that have anxiety. You don't want to just one thing I'm very opposed to is just relying on medicine to cure your anxiety, because actually the medicine that they give you for anxiety actually triggers sensitive people. And there are many doctors will tell you don't take it if you're sensitive, because you're more sensitive to what it does to the brain. So you can actually manage anxiety by having more downtime, being more creative, making sure you do self-care, you exercise, you eat right. Food is very important to your body. It's like medicine, actually. So I always look to what I'm eating and nutrition as something that is so important to me. I'm very careful about what I eat and put into my body. I don't take any unnecessary medicines. Very sensitive to medicines, and so I'm very analytical about researching them. So I think it's important for everyone to take an important look at what they are putting into their body, what they're doing, how they feel. Emotions are very natural. In fact, 70% of women, as an example, are feelers on the Myers-Briggs test. So it's okay to feel. You don't always want to think. And many of us grew up in a sort of masculine dominated educational system where it was more about thinking. But we're evolving now, as there are more female leaders, into a world where it's just as important how you feel about things. And so I think that there's a lot of change going on in the scientific world, fortunately. I mean, in the past, they didn't really do much research on things like empathy. You know, scientists tend to shun things like people who can, you know, predict things through intuition. And I just think it's so important to use the skills that you have. And if you're an intuitive, a creative, or someone who can see the future before others, you can understand what I'm talking about. It's something that is real, and it's something that can also cause anxiety, because if you can see the future before others, you're worried about what's coming down the pike next. And so I put a lot of time and effort into my research, for example, in, you know, business, politics, current events. And there are a lot of things, obviously, to worry about right now. But we also have to remember that we have to have a lot of positive energy in us to get through difficult times. And I think that maintaining a positive outlook is probably, you know, a very important quality for all of us. And it's something, I mean, fortunately, I was born with a positive outlook. I think that's something that's innate to me. But there are times when, you know, the stresses of the world become too much. And I think we've seen the stats on that there are many more people who are suffering from things like anxiety or depression, which are different, by the way, and I'm going to define that next. Anxiety is about worrying about the future. Depression is about worrying about the past. So I have never had depression. I've always been worried about the future. So that's anxiety. Those are anxious feelings about the future. But, you know, some of that can be good because you're a very responsible person, because, you know, you're worried about what could happen. So you plan ahead. You don't get into situations that are bad. You're a really careful person. So a lot of these things can be very positive. And so to be someone who has anxiety, however, can have downsides such as panic attacks, and that is the worst feeling. Fortunately, I don't have panic attacks very often anymore because I learned how to cut out the things that were causing me too much anxiety. So as an example, I don't drive on the highway ever. Okay, fortunately, there are enough roads here in Florida where you don't have to. But I wouldn't even consider, I've seen, sometimes there are 2 accidents a day on the highway near where I am in Florida. We've had airplanes land on the highway right around the corner. I mean, there's no way I'm getting on a highway. So that's just the way that I live my life. So I don't have to worry about that. I don't take long trips in a car because I don't like the motion. So I'm more sensitive to motion as I get older. I know that about myself. I can't really take flying trips anymore. I mean, with all the stuff going on with Boeing and airplanes and the problems, even just going to the airport causes anxiety for a lot of people. It's one of the number one anxieties is flying. So I know many people who don't fly anymore. You know, that may change in the future if flying gets easier, but it's very expensive. A lot of people can't afford to travel, so it's not something that I really think about anymore as something that I want to do. Fortunately, I live in Florida, so I'm pretty able to stay in one place. It gets very hot here in the summer, but for me, being sensitive, I'd rather be hot than cold. So we all have our, you know, ups and downs. It's prohibitively hot in the summer. You can't go out much, but that's okay for me because I am someone who actually, you know, can live in a quiet type period of the summer. And I have a lot of reading that I do, a lot of different projects I'm involved in for my work. And I am someone who likes to make other people happy. I have a lot of people who depend upon me. And I believe that it's important to do your best job at the projects that you have in life. And so I would not want to do things in a mediocre way. That's never been an option for me. I put a lot of pressure on myself to be a perfectionist. I mean, I always have. Partially it was the way I was raised, was to do things well. And there was, a fair amount of pressure to do things very well. So it's through the educational system I was in and achievement oriented. It's just something that I have lived with my whole life. And to do things well, you can't be doing too many things. So if you're an anxious person, sometimes you have to cut back on the things that you're doing so that you can do a couple of those important things very well. So as an example, I have been on my condo board recently, and because I have a very important role there, and a lot of the owners are dependent upon what I do, it's important for me to do a really good job at that for a lot of reasons, but it does require a lot of concentration, it requires a lot of time, and it can become overwhelming at times, but you just have to make sure that you cut out some of the other things in your life. Unfortunately, it cuts into my social life. I haven't done a lot of social things this year because of the projects I've been doing. So it has a downside. So you still have to find ways to have downtime and also be creative. As I said, like even recording these videos and podcasts is creative work for me because I get to edit them or do other things and meet people and research things. So it's using both the right and left side of my brain, and it's back to the brain and anxiety. I think that, again, it's important that if you have anxiety, you want to understand more about the right brain versus left brain, because you may be spending too much time on the left brain side of the world, which you were socialized in, and you may need to use the right side of your brain more. And that is something that, I've met amazingly talented people who can use both sides of their brain, and it's just so impressive to watch. And through meeting a lot of successful leaders, some of the most interesting leaders that I've met were able to use both the left brain and the right brain. That's such a rare skill. I mean, there are some people that are so left brain dominated, they just can't even think outside the box. But when you meet the creative thinkers or the divergent thinkers, I am a divergent thinker, so I tend to see things from different directions. That's why I'm a good intermediator, good at negotiations, because I can step into the shoes of both parties and try and get to yes. As an intermediary, that's what I did most of my career in executive search, trying to find the right people for corporations and executive job openings, and convincing people that my candidate was the right person, and so forth and so on. But there are a lot of challenges involved in intermediation. It's not always easy, and there are a lot of challenges involved in being sensitive, quite honestly. But we're born sensitive. We can't change that. It's not like someone's going to turn off the sensitive switch. I mean, it's a way of life. And I think the most important thing that I could end with for people is to say that it's really important to appreciate your anxiety, to be able to communicate. You are sensitive and you have vulnerability just like anyone else. And I think the high functioning anxiety people are afraid to admit that they have anxiety, but it's not a bad thing. So I've found as I got older in life that sometimes when you admit that you are a little bit afraid of things, like, I don't really like to drive long distance. Sometimes I make new friends that way because someone's like, oh, I love to drive, I'll drive you. And it actually sparks new friendships. So I'm not afraid to admit, my strengths or my weaknesses. I think I don't even call them weaknesses. I always call them sort of, things I'm good at, things maybe I'm not so good at. I'm not good at everything. That I'm perfectly happy to say that. I think no one is good at everything. I think we all need to understand that and just be more honest about what we need help with, because there are people who need help right now. And I think the worst thing we can do is judge and criticize other people for being different. And I find there are some people who think that, everyone's just like them. And I think one of their life lessons has to be that no, not everyone is like you. Indeed, there are 16 personality types on the Myers-Briggs at least, and there are all kinds of different people out there, and there are different types of leaders. Some are introverted, yes, some are extroverted, and some are sensitive, some are not so sensitive. But we all have to work together to create a bright future. And I am really delighted to have spent this time with you today talking about high functioning anxiety. Thanks for listening to my podcast. You can subscribe at Career Expert on YouTube. I'm Sandra Rupp. You can also contact me on LinkedIn if you would like an executive coaching session on career, life, or leadership. I enjoy meeting new people and talking to people virtually through video calls or by telephone. And I look forward to speaking with you again in the near future. Thanks for watching.